On this week's 51%, the accessibility of the key abortion pill Mifepristone hangs in the balance after a federal judge in Texas ruled to suspend the FDA's approval of the drug earlier this month. We speak with Harvard Law School's Carmel Shahar about the ins and outs of the case.
This is a really important case, not just for abortion access, but for the future of the pharmaceutical industry.
I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jesse King. Earlier this month, U.S. District Judge Matthew Kaczmarek of Texas handed opponents of abortion a potential victory by issuing a preliminary injunction to suspend the 23-year-old Food and Drug Administration approval for the key abortion pill Mifepristone. Mifepristone is one of two drugs used in medication abortions in the first trimester, which make up a majority of the abortions in the U.S. The procedure itself has effectively been banned in 13 states since the fall of Roe v. Wade last year, according to the Guttmacher Institute, with many others imposing other restrictions or alternatively doing what they can to expand abortion access. But the plaintiffs in this case, called Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus FDA, seek to end mifepristone sales nationwide, even in states where abortion is legal. Now, this has been an extremely fast-moving news story. The same day the Texas order was announced, a court in Washington issued a dueling injunction protecting mifepristone access in certain states. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled to preserve partial access to the drug while the cases play out, but with new restrictions. Drug maker GenBioPro sued the FDA, saying that revoking the approval for the generic version of the drug would cause catastrophic harm to the company. And both the Justice Department and Denko Laboratories, the manufacturer behind the name-brand version of mifepristone called Mifeprex, have asked the Supreme Court to weigh in on how things should proceed. The Supreme Court was expected to make its move by the time we taped today's episode, but it recently decided to extend an administrative stay on the matter by a few more days. So as of this taping, mifepristone remains widely available. But it's certainly one big, confusing legal mess, and our first guest is here to help untangle it. Carmel Shahar is the executive director of Harvard Law School's Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics.
It's really important to understand that what's happening right now is not a review of the case on the merits, as a lawyer would say. Like, the Supreme Court is not looking to see, okay, should the FDA have approved this medication at all? The district judge made a ruling, and he said, okay, looking at the initial round of briefs, it seems like the plaintiffs would succeed. I'm issuing a stay to say this drug needs to be taken off the market, pending further legal resolution. The Fifth Circuit looked at the question of, okay, as this case works its way through the courts, should this medication stay on the market, or does it need to be completely pulled? And they kind of did almost a compromise position where they said, okay, it doesn't need to be completely pulled. The FDA was correct in 2000. It was 2000, kind of, there's a statute of limitations here. But some of its newer regulatory changes in access should be paused. So essentially, they're peeling back anything that wasn't part of the original FDA decision. The Supreme Court now is deciding, okay, what does access look like as this case kind of winds its way through the court and ultimately likely ends up back on the Supreme Court docket?
So let's go back to the Texas case that started this. What are the arguments being made here? And I guess, in your opinion, why is mifepristone suddenly getting all this attention?
At heart, for this case, is whether a certain medication, mifepristone, should be available to patients. A big part of the focus of this case is that medication abortion, as opposed to surgical abortion, is more portable. And the worry is that women are stockpiling these pills or accessing them through online websites. and using it to have abortions, even in states where it's now illegal to have abortions. Now, it's possible to have a medication abortion without mifepristone, but those abortions are more painful and have higher risks of things going wrong, although overall it is still pretty safe. But that other medication is also approved for other things, so it's a little bit harder to challenge, whereas mifepristone has this what's called REMS around it. And so I think it was seen as a little bit of an easier approval to try to undermine. So some advocacy groups filed a case saying that the FDA improperly approved the drug and that the drug should not, in fact, be available in the US marketplace.
If the argument here is that the approval process for mifepristone was inadequate or rushed, I guess we should talk about how does the FDA approval process actually work? Are there instances where drugs have been rushed toward approval in the past?
So the FDA has a long process that is set up to capture whether a medication is, one, effective, does it do what the manufacturer claims that it does, as well as safe. And so there are certain stages of trials that you need to go through in order to demonstrate, okay, this is safe, but here are maybe some of the side effects or adverse outcomes. Okay, is it effective compared to a control population? And so they rely heavily on clinical studies and data from very structured trials. The FDA relies on committees of experts to evaluate the data. There are cases where medications are expedited through various accelerated programs. So I think the case that comes to mind these days are the COVID mRNA vaccines that got pushed through under emergency use authorization to try to get them out to market as fast as possible. Mifepristone was not part of any accelerated pathway. It actually was a really lengthy approval process that took about 4 years, in part because even though at the time of the initial application, there was really great data from France where the drug had been approved, the FDA said, okay, we don't want to just look at French data because we're not France, so we want some fresh data that's more applicable to America. So I would say overall, the FDA did not cut any corners looking at mifepristone and was very conscious of the fact that this was going to be a politically controversial medication.
Does the court really have the power to overrule a federal agency like this? Do you know if this has happened before?
This is the big open question. To date, there hasn't been a case where a judge has said, okay, FDA, you got all of the data, but I think that you interpreted the data wrong, because judges are experts in many things, but they're generally not also physicians or scientists. They don't know medical data the way that the FDA does. So this is a really important case, not just for abortion access, but for the future of the pharmaceutical industry. If it sets a precedent that, okay, any district court judge can actually undo FDA approval and say, well, actually, I don't think that medication is safe, so it shouldn't be on the market.
So obviously, I mean, as of our conversation right now, we haven't heard anything yet from the Supreme Court on this, but we're expecting to soon. Let's lay out what are all the possibilities here, and how does this look going forward for each of those possibilities?
If the Supreme Court said, yep, the district judge got it right, then there would be no access to mifepristone across the country. If the Supreme Court said, you know what, we think that the Fifth Circuit's half in, half out approach was the right one, that it can be available the way that it was in 2000, but not since then, it would still be available, but it would be very limited or much more limited. Especially, you wouldn't really be able to do the abortion by mail that women have been using right now, because you would have to go into the pharmacy in person. So people couldn't legally mail you these medications. Mm-hmm. Now, another complication is that on the same day that the Texas District Court judge ruled, another federal judge in Washington state actually had an opposite ruling where it said that the FDA shouldn't be limiting the availability of Mifepristone in about 18 states that were part of the suit, and that the FDA needed to ensure access to this medication. And so that's going to be kind of confusing, because what do you do with the district court's order in Washington and the district court's order in Texas, where they're kind of squarely at odds with each other?
So basically, no matter what, this is going to be going back and forth for a while before it's resolved.
I think so. I think at minimum, the case is then going to wind its way up on full appeal through the Fifth Circuit and probably to the Supreme Court. I think the Washington case will need to be resolved. I think when Dobbs came out, there was sort of an attitude from the Supreme Court of like, okay, there's no constitutional right to abortion. We are sort of getting out of the abortion jurisprudence business. This is now up to the states. It's not our thing at all. But I think that that was a bit of a pipe dream for them. I think they are very much going to be in the abortion business as issues like this wind their way through the courts.
How does the FDA move forward with this when they've got competing information coming from two different sources?
I think there are a lot of people at the FDA who have worked some very long hours over the last week or so. The FDA does have some enforcement discretion to say, okay, can it look the other way in terms of who's accessing Mifepristone, how's it being sent around? But I think that it puts the FDA in a difficult case to have two competing federal cases instructing it to do two different things. And I think that it's frankly really bad for the pharmaceutical industry, even if ultimately the FDA does prevail, to set a precedent that, okay, a district court judge can pause access to any given medication. That's really disruptive for companies, for business plans. They can't just stop and start easily.
I guess lastly, where do you see the broader legal battle over abortion rights going after this?
So I think the broader legal battle over abortion is going to really test the relationship of the states to each other. We're now in a very polarized country where some states are incredibly committed to supporting access to abortion, and some states are incredibly committed to closing off access to abortion. And so what happens when states try to limit the ability of people to cross state lines to receive abortion services? So what can Texas do to prevent me from traveling to California for an abortion? What can Texas do to prevent me as a Texas resident from going online and accessing information about abortion? If there are physicians providing abortion services or abortion follow-up care across state lines, what are the implications there? Especially now where health is really digital and with the access to medication abortion, our state boundaries are so much more porous than they were pre-Roe. And so these issues are going to get litigated again and again.
Carmel Shachar is the executive director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. You can learn more at petrieflom.law.harvard.edu. Since news of the Texas case broke, state officials and local organizations have been scrambling to put together a response. WAMC's Pat Bradley brings us reactions from both sides of the abortion debate here in the Northeast.
Representatives from Planned Parenthood of Northern New England offices in Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire gathered for a virtual press conference Monday to discuss the implications of the ruling that could end the use of Mifepristone. Planned Parenthood of Northern New England acting CEO Nicole Clegg said the language in the decision reflects the judge's political bias.
It was medically inaccurate, a refusal to use language to accurately and appropriately describe pregnancy and abortion care. I think that it just lays bare the political motivations of this judge to restrict access to abortion, tied himself into knots, and disregarded any kind of medical research and science to justify the actions that he was taking. So it makes it abundantly clear what the ultimate goal here is. People who are opposed to legal abortion will stop at nothing. They are going to do everything they can until they make it impossible to access abortion anywhere in our country. And that includes Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, where these rights are protected.
Vermont Right to Life Executive Director Mary Beerworth finds the Planned Parenthood perspective ironic.
These are the people that use the courts to get legalized abortion in the first place. It was political from beginning to end. Abortion was never in the United States Constitution, and it was overturned. So if they're getting their game played right back at them, well, I think there's some kind of ironic justice there. And I think there is good reason to believe that the FDA has to take another look at Mifepristone.
In November, Vermont voters passed a state constitutional amendment protecting reproductive autonomy. Vice President of Public Affairs at Planned Parenthood of Northern New England for Vermont, Lucy Larish, explains why the latest decision bypasses the new state constitutional protection.
The case is filed against the FDA for the process of their approval of Mifepristone. So because this decision could affect the very approval of the drug and the supply of the drug, that is why it's limited what individual states can do.
Several states plan to stockpile Mifepristone. In Massachusetts, healthcare providers are amassing the drug following a request by Democratic Governor Maura Healey, who spoke at the State House Monday.
Abortion will remain safe, legal, and accessible here in Massachusetts.
Larish says Planned Parenthood of Northern New England is not, but is consulting with Vermont Governor Phil Scott's administration regarding options for other providers.
Planned Parenthood has made the decision that we will not be stockpiling medications in our health centers. That said, I do believe that some folks are having conversations with the Scott administration, and we will see how those go.
Clegg clarified when asked about potential stockpiling at their Maine affiliates.
At this point in time, we have the inventory that we need to serve the patients that we anticipate. This is, again, of course, a very dynamic situation and things could change. We, as a healthcare provider, are not taking steps to stockpile this. This is in large part driven by our desire to make sure that we don't negatively impact access in other parts of the country. We want to make sure that abortion providers, regardless of where you are able to continue to provide this care as long as you can legally.
Meanwhile, Beerworth feels abortion proponents are generating hysteria over the judge's ruling.
Abortion is fully legal and fully protected, and I think it's much ado about nothing. There are plenty of abortion methods to use. It's amazing how the overturning of Roe v. Wade has almost left us completely feeling like there's no other option for women. There are several options for women. Number one, they can be in responsible relationships with men. And number two, they can have the baby, and they can consider putting a child up for adoption, where there are so many couples seeking not only to adopt one child, but to adopt 2 and 3.
A coalition of 24 attorneys general, including from New York, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont, have filed an amicus brief challenging the decision that would revoke the FDA approval of Mifepristone. I'm Pat Bradley, WAMC News.
Thank you, Pat. So how does Mifepristone work? We know it has a 23-year history in the U.S. and an even longer presence in other countries. The FDA approved the drug for use at up to 10 weeks of pregnancy, but the ruling by the Fifth Circuit would restrict use to up to 7 weeks of pregnancy. Our last guests are part of the Collaboratory at the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, a public health project on South Pearl Street in Albany, New York. Dr. Wendy Parker is the program's director, while Jackie Dwyer is its on-site pharmacist. The Collaboratory works closely with Albany's underserved populations, and both Parker and Dwyer are concerned that the recent court rulings could have a catastrophic impact on abortion access for low-income communities. I stopped by recently to hear their concerns and get the rundown on the drug itself.
So Mifepristone works by blocking the action of progesterone in the uterus. So progesterone is one of, if not the most important hormone to sustain a pregnancy. So mifepristone will work by blocking the action of progesterone in the uterus, causing the uterus to contract and expel the pregnancy. It's usually given along with misoprostol, which is a prostaglandin, which works differently but also has the same effect in the end of expelling the pregnancy.
Are there any side effects with it?
Some women will notice some nausea, vomiting, lightheadedness, but the main side effects are actually just related to the abortion itself, so cramping, bleeding, and things like that.
Okay. And generally, what's the safety of it? I mean, is it a safe drug to use?
So it's actually really safe. When used appropriately, which is typically less than 10 weeks of pregnancy, and with no other underlying factors like bleeding disorders, a person shouldn't have an IUD in place if they're using this drug. The risk of dying is something like less than 0.0005%, which, just for a little bit of reference, the risk of dying in pregnancy or childbirth or postpartum is 15 or more times higher than that. It became recently available in 2021 via mail order, and I think that's what the legal issues today are focused on.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that I think that's what's changed, is that the medication abortions, when all these other restrictions started coming into play in the last few years, medication abortion rates went way up. In fact, I think they've doubled in the last 5 years, maybe. Something like that. And so people were using that as a way to access it without being able to travel. And so for things that we care about here deeply at the Collaboratory is universal access, right? Mm-hmm. And so people who can't afford to travel to a state maybe where they can get a legal abortion still, medication abortions and telehealth and the availability to get it online is a really huge component of this. So yes, that's a huge part of what we're worried about, I guess I would say now.
Yeah, definitely.
And so what was your reaction when this news came out?
I think it just added to the list of things I'm concerned about for women in general. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and we had a conversation the other day in one of my classes with some students and said, it's very interesting to think that people of their generation may have less access to reproductive choices than people of my generation or even my parents' generation, and we just talked about that a little bit in terms of what does that mean for them and what are their options as they sort of move ahead. That's where my head is at, is sort of thinking about what are we doing to make changes to keep things open.
And I think it's kind of important to note that taking away access to this drug, it's really not going to change, it's not going to decrease abortion rates. You can still have a medication abortion with just misoprostol alone, but it's not quite as effective and it's not quite as safe, meaning that people who choose to use misoprostol alone without that mifepristone are more likely to end up needing to go into the hospital and have a DNC or have other complications related to, the pregnancy not being fully terminated. So that's, it's not really reducing the abortion rate, it's just kind of decreasing another safe option.
Mm-hmm. I think that should be deeply concerning to anybody who cares about women in general and women's health more broadly. I know that as different bans have come into effect and people have started to have to be more creative with their both birth control and getting access to abortions if they need it, I think the key things to remember are that over half of our pregnancies in this country are unintended. And that the vast majority of people who get abortions already have kids. So this isn't about not wanting a child. In many cases, it is about not feeling able or the affordability to have that child for whatever reasons. And a lot of the bans that have gone into effect, including what will happen if we don't have access to the medication one, is people who will have no choices, no options, even in the case of rape or incest, any of those kind of bans, or for the life of the mother, that won't be factored into some of these things.
How does this affect you guys here at the Collaboratory?
Well, right now, New York has still been a pretty safe place for us to have access to things and to have access to abortion providers. So we're not dramatically concerned at the moment. Mm-hmm. I think we are engaging a number of agencies and groups in conversation about how do we make sure that that doesn't change, right? How do we ensure that that access still remains? Because one of the other things about medication abortions are they tend to be the most affordable option right now. And so affordability is something we care about here as well. And so in addition to making sure people have access, we want to make sure that they can afford to keep that access. So that's part of what we're trying to advocate for.
If you're looking for Mifepristone, like right now, when all of this craziness is going on, is there anything that you would like people to know?
I would say if you're listening to this in New York State, you're lucky. And if you feel that you need this medication, I would call your OBGYN or your local Planned Parenthood as soon as possible. Not to say that in a scary sort of way, but I think that for many reasons, timeliness is key.
The effectiveness of the drug is also better in those early weeks too. So
yes, exactly.
That helps as well. But again, if you live in New York State, consider yourself a little bit lucky right now.
Lastly, I thought I'd ask you a little bit about just sort of the collaboratory in general.
Sure.
What are the kind of services that you guys provide? How long have you guys been around, actually?
Sure. So we opened in 2018. This is a new location for us. We just moved here. We're having a grand reopening in a couple weeks. So the idea behind it was a laboratory for collaboration, looking at how pharmacy and public health in particular, along with some of the other health sciences, could work together to help the underserved in our community. So we have a public health pharmacist, Jackie, who is an alumni of ACPHS as well. And then we have a pharmacy technician that was hired from the community and trained. And then we have an operations manager who has her master's in public health. So it's sort of the combination of all those skills. We also partner with Trinity Alliance here, who have community health workers. So they do a lot of the on-the-ground, door-to-door patient navigation, getting people insurance, and that kind of work. Everything we offer right now is free to the community. We also offer a lot of chronic disease programming, so a lot of hypertension, a lot of diabetes, things that we knew were large disparities in this community are what we sort of went to work with first. And we have a food as medicine program where we deliver fresh fruit and produce and lean meats to clients. So we do a lot of home visits. Jackie knows her way all around the South End and Arbor Hill in a different way. We are a point of care testing site. So we can do A1C and blood glucose kind of testing that has like about a 5-minute time frame on it. So you can know right away if you're doing a good job of controlling your diabetes or hypertension, that kind of stuff.
I really like that intersection of sort of like, taking a public health aspect to it too.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about sort of like why it's so important to sort of take that approach, or why it's at least particularly important to you guys?
Yeah, so public health is all about prevention, right? So one of the things that we talk about all the time is thinking upstream. So this idea of getting people before they get sick and before they're in the healthcare system. And we know that in communities like the South End of Albany, there are a lot of people who don't trust the healthcare system for good reason in many cases, right? But they don't access the healthcare system the way that maybe we do. And so what we want to do is try to get to them and get them access to the same kind of care, preventive care, screenings, cancer screenings, all of those kind of things, annual wellness visits, anything that we can do to sort of keep people healthy and keep them out of the emergency rooms is what our real goal is. And I think on the flip side, the other thing that public health does really focus on is disparities, right? And so one of the things that we're very concerned about here in the South End is there are huge, and especially as it connects to maternal health, there's a huge difference in maternal mortality for Black women in the South End compared to anybody else in the Capital Region. And we don't really know why. Despite decades of trying to figure out what's going on, we still don't have great answers. And so those are the kinds of things that we really want to focus on. And some of that is just about taking time with people and talking to them and figuring out what they need and how to help them.
Dr. Wendy Parker is an associate professor and the executive director of the Collaboratory at the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. Jackie Dwyer is an on-staff pharmacist with the center. You can learn more at acphs.org/collaboratory. Given how fast the news changes, and again, this episode was taped before the Supreme Court issued its ruling on Mifepristone restrictions, we will certainly revisit this topic and the larger issue of reproductive care, as we often do. You can find our past episodes on abortion at WAMCpodcasts.org. You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King, with help from our associate producer, Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcasts.org or wherever you get your podcasts. On social media, we're at WAMC Radio, and you can stay in the loop by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. They said, oh, I want a big life, not a house I could have been like. Where are you taking me? Where are you taking me? Said